what I will do is I will reconstruct a historical sequence very briefly in the unfolding relationship of capitalism and democracy, and trying from this background to say something on the present situation and on the options that are in front of us, although I have to admit that as far as what is going to happen in the next 10 years, I'm as clueless as everybody else, of course. But what I think I know is that something that several very surprising and gigantic things are in store, although we don't know them yet. So I begin by briefly recalling what used to be called the post-war settlement of democratic capital. And here we're talking about the configuration after 1945 in the west of the industrialized world, based on a class compromise that came out of the war. It was historically new, based on the Anglo-American experience of the Great Expression and the war. Elements of the New Deal, the war economy, wartime coalitions between center-left and center-right, Keynes and Beveridge, and after 1945, this was the model that, basically pushed by the United States, became the standard model of the political organization of those nations that were part of the West. It had clearly political intentions, prevent the return of fascism, and contain communism. And these two things were so together spoke for both democracy as a way of preventing autarky, fascism, war, and so on, and then construct a political system that would convince the working class that communism was not what they wanted. So, what was the content of this settlement? I suggest that it can be encapsulated in what you see there. Working class accepts capitalism and private capital accumulation in exchange for full employment, social security through the welfare state, steady growth without cyclical crises, rising general prosperity, compression of social and economic inequality, end of poverty. You could add a few more things to this, but it was clear that the reinstallment of capitalism after the war economy was conditional on the promise that these things would now be the safe, reliable entitlement of the working class and of the organized working class. And that sort of the restoration of the hunting license of capitalists, so to speak, depended on them behaving civilly along these lines and sharing the booty with others. Yeah? And out of this comes what I call the standard model of post-war democracy. And essentially, this was the institutional setup that became widespread in the West, with sort of national variations that political scientists often care too much about, like presidential system versus Westminster system versus first past the post, and so on, all very important. But the core of this were these characteristics: general franchise, reasonably free elections, reasonably in the sense that in countries where the communists were weak, they had to go to prison, like in West Germany, and or in the United States, they were completely excluded from everything. reasonably free elections, legislation by parliament, elected government under parliamentary control, a reasonably free press, mass political parties, center-right and center-left, ready to alternate in government, and strong trade unions. This is something that is often forgotten. This was the second pillar of democracy. Trade unions with the right to strike and to collective bargaining. And it was it was important, it was essential, because the acceptance of a market economy depended on a political institutional system that was capable of redistributing the product of the market economy so that it didn't go only to capital. Redistribution through the social welfare state was one channel, and that was through elections, parties, and so on. But there was a second channel, which was important because life at the workplace could be regulated only by democracy at the workplace, through trade unions. And it was not only secondary distribution that could heal the built-in accumulation, asymmetrical accumulation tendency of capitalism, but it also needed a redistribution at the workplace, at the primary system. So that essentially was the deal. And this was important because it enabled the working classes, you can also say the people, to actively intervene in the market, not to wait for some technocrats to readjust something, but to use political power, self-organized, to be reassured that even if the technocrats sort of deserted them, they would be able to step in. And in that sense, democracy as a participatory institution was crucial to the acceptance of capitalism, because in addition to the market, it offered a second system of allocation, which had to be capable of correcting allocation according to the Matthew principle, as Robert Merton called it, of the market, which Matthew 19, such and such, I think 25, where he says, "He who hath will be given, and he who does not have will be taken away what he has." And that's the market. You can also call it cumulative advantage. And in order to overcome this, you need democracy. But in order to have democracy, you need institutions. And in the post-war world, these were sort of the institutions that were designed to achieve this, closely linked to the state. Now, democracy, in addition, was anchored in an economic order, which you could call, or which one calls the Keynesian growth model, within which democratic egalitarianism figured as a productive force. Now, that is extremely important. In the Keynesian world, growth is maintained, promoted by the purchasing power of the small guy, so to speak. Yeah? But that purchasing power first has to be allocated to him. And for this you need redistribution, democracy. So democracy becomes a productive force. It is seen as a driver of economic growth. Therefore, it is not just about social justice. It's also about efficiency of the capitalist economy. So the understanding is that this regime would not only avoid political discontent, but it could at the same time avoid the sort of growth crisis that happened in the interwar years due to lack of effective demand, which was due to lack of effective democracy. Yeah? So the functionalist justification of democracy as a tool for capitalist growth, that was the unique construction of the post-war system. Now we know that roughly in the 1970s, and historians are only now beginning to, in earnest, to begin to understand this critical juncture. Roughly in the 1970s, this configuration broke up and was replaced by an emerging, completely new configuration in which democracy plays a very different role, if at all. So we now know about the profit squeeze and the capitalist counter-revolution after 1968, late 1960s, when in all these Western countries, the rising expectations of the working class or of suppressed groups began to challenge the slow progress that was instituted under the democratic capitalist system. But they wanted more. And the others felt like they had now long enough, 3 decades, pretended that they were milk cows or a social infrastructure that could be milked by the working class, machinery for wealth production. They now rediscovered that they were actually wild animals who wanted to go hunting rather than sit in the stable and get fed a sort of secure but limited diet. Yeah? So capitalism rediscovers itself as a world of predators eating those that can't defend themselves. The way out of the cage was globalization, and now we are beginning to see how this worked, both political as well as technologically, as well as economically, through contingent events, through like the Eurodollars, through technological innovations like the new transportation systems and the like. It's a very complex story, but in the core, as far as the power relations in this system are concerned, we see a shift of power to those that own resources that they can take out of a country and put them somewhere else. Resource dependence is a very useful concept, and labor, stationary labor, is dependent on resources that others command, and as these can move these resources elsewhere, their power increases. It's basically that simple, but it is played through in many different sort of permutations in different places and so on. So what then begins is a process preempting and disciplining national politics, often with the support of national governments who themselves felt unable to manage the rising expectations of their voters, needed some instrument to discipline them, while expanding markets and increasing competitive pressure. Yeah? And this is sort of the underlying cantus firmus, so to speak, that begins in the 1970s. A process of neoliberal restructuring resulting from this, which has a very peculiar sort of economic phase. It restores profits, while at the same time overall growth rates slowly decline. However, inequality increases, depressing growth, and at the expense of growing debt. And I want to show you the three, so what I call the three apocalyptic horsemen of capitalism after 1970, declining growth rates. And here we're looking at the capitalist system as a whole, not just individual countries. And in this diagram, we use 5-year sliding averages to take out to take out the fluctuations, and you see how things are declining. At the same time, growth rates are inequality is increasing throughout the OECD, and public debt is shooting up. Yeah? So these three things, these are allies. They sort of reinforce each other. They show incidentally that by increasing public debt, you do no longer increase growth. This is non-Keynesian debt in the sense that it never is repaid. It accumulates over time. Yeah? And it is sort of a toolkit of tricks by which you can keep the patient breathing, but only up to a certain point. And the question is, where is the point? Yeah? The same with inequality increasing. The same with growth declining. Yeah? Just for your information from McKinsey Global Research this year, this is after the crisis of 2008. And you see that whatever consolidation policies may have taken place in the 1990s, to which I will come, after 2008, private debt was sort of constant or even deleveraged, but public debt again continues with an enormous push. Yeah? And overall debt is even worse. This is debt in the world economy, global, and you see it's going up every year and at an astonishing speed. Yeah? So this is what we now see as the neoliberal growth formula comes with broken promises. We now hear about the natural rate of unemployment, about the spread of precarious employment, the decoupling of wages from productivity, the return of the business cycle in the shape of financial crisis, the end of welfare as we know it, as a democratic American president called it, the recommodification of life and of the welfare state. And there's no need to add to this list. It is entirely different from what used to be the promise of the time when this system was installed. Now, very importantly, also for the continuing story, is that this came together with a shift to a new growth model, from Keynesianism to what I call Hayekianism. This growth model is sort of a very strange animal. It basically works through competition, the imposition of uncertainty, and what they call work incentives. You have to get people to work. Well, at the same time, inequality increases. How is that? Because there's a twofold double anthropology behind this thing. At the lower end of the income distribution, people work more if you take money away from them. At the upper end, people work harder if you give them more money. Lower taxes, higher management salaries. Yeah? So the guy who used to run Volkswagen a few years ago, his yearly salary was roughly 3 million euros, and he told his board that if he gets 14 million euros as he feels he is entitled to, he will work even harder. So, whereas the unemployed work harder if you cut unemployment benefits, so you get less. Yeah? So in this world, where contrary to Keynesianism, here growth is created by redistribution from the bottom to the top. And in this world, democracy is a liability, not an asset. It is too slow, too corrupt, public choice, too dumb, under-complex is the word, a burden on efficiency, as well as interfering with individual freedom of choice. So then, what you have is a need for replacing national democracy with what they now call global governance. Global governance is sort of government without democracy. There's no participation there. At least not in the standard model. And indeed, in parallel to the shift from the Keynesian growth model to the Hayekian growth model, which was a gradual shift and therefore so difficult to nail down when it was going on. But I claim we're now almost there. Parallel to this, the standard model sort of decayed in the direction of a decoupling of capitalism and democracy. In the Hayekian world, you can have democracy, but it must never interfere with the market. So what you have to do is, you have to cut out of the democratic process everything that could sort of redistribute against the Matthew principle. Yeah. The principle of cumulative advantage must be preserved to preserve investment incentives, work incentives. So what happens here? The decay of the standard model. Electoral turnout over these years, as people see that democracy is no longer considered and no longer able to be a productive economic force, people lose interest. So this is participation in national parliamentary elections from the 1950s to the 2000s. And it goes down. It goes down not just generally, but most importantly, there is an enormous correlation with income and economic status. The lower you are in the income distribution, the less you feel you want to go to vote. This is British data. We have the unemployed as a percentage of working age population in the by constituencies, and turnout versus owner-occupied houses by constituencies. And you see, this is such a beautiful correlation that normally, as a social scientist, you dream of finding something like this for your hypotheses. So electoral turnout goes down, and it goes down asymmetrically. Party membership, this is from Peter Mayer's book on hollowing out. Party membership declines. It only increases in a country like Greece, where party membership means something different from normal party membership. Access to employment. And all of this. Greece and Spain. Otherwise, it's sort of falling through the floor. The trade union membership declines throughout, so that also the other channel goes with. And in fact, strikes almost disappear after 1980 as a result of the end of inflation. Yeah. What I've shown in the book is the existence of this segments of crises that coincides with the installment of the Hayekian system. Basically, every decade is a decade of a different kind of crisis, which begins as a solution to a distributional problem and then turns into a problem itself. The 1970s were a year of inflation, or a decade of inflation. Inflation at the time was a way of maintaining employment in the face of increasing wage pressure. So you had to do something to keep everybody happy, and as a result you allowed for inflation. Yeah? John Goldthorpe at the time said, in capitalism you always have to have inflation. That was wrong. In 1980, the Americans ended inflation by introducing interest rates of roughly 20% for a year. And then public debt took over in the same function as a sort of pacifier for everybody else, because they couldn't tax anymore in the world of globalization. So they replaced taxes with credit. Yeah. In the 1990s, we turned to a period where, in an effort at consolidating public finances, we see the first period of budget cutting and of general consolidation, which, however, it creates a problem with respect to mass legitimacy of the system on the one hand, and effective demand on the other hand. And that you solve by allowing people, individuals, or forcing them to take up credit on their own rather than the state. Yeah. And so you get sort of privatized gains in the 1990s. This sort of collapses in 2008, and where we end. And today, the new pacifier, the new trick, is monetary expansion. Yeah. I forgot to bring this diagram from the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, where they show how the balance sheets of the major central banks have increased by a factor of 1 to 2.5 over since 2007, so 9 years. Yeah. They go up it's the next pacifier that will create the next problem, the next solution that will result in the next problem. And it is interesting to see, just for our topic, how this hangs together with fundamental restructuring of public finance from the traditional tax state to the debt state to the consolidation state, which today results in public austerity. And this hangs together with the shift, as I say, upwards of the arenas of conflict. From, in the 1970s, labor relations. You could go on strike together with your buddy and face your oppressor. And that was the guy on the other side of industry. You could see them. You could do something about it. It has a sort of physical dimension. In the 1980s, it was about going to vote and defend the social welfare state against cuts every 4 years, not as often. And then, of course, in the next period, the conflict arena becomes financial markets. You go to your banker. That's a very strange battle you have with the banker sits here, you sit there, he knows everything, and he has all the power. And you have to behave and be nice to him. Yeah? And now, we see how all this sort of moves even further away from where political collective action in a democratic sense takes place. And this is central banks, international monetary policy, institutions that nobody understands. But basically, who knows what the central bank is doing? They can't tell you because they work only if they work in secrecy. And sometimes they don't even know what they are doing. And the mode of participation sort of shifts from strikes to elections to post-democracy that comes, yeah, and then what today? Mass protests, populism, and so on. I'm sort of touching on this in order to say that what we now see in terms of populism, left and right, is something that has a sort of history, and it is the history of the increasing abstractification of political arenas and political participation opportunities in the transition from the standard model to the post-standard Hayekian model, where basically democracy is decoupled from effective decisions affecting people's lives. And in this world, you have to take to other tools. Yeah? So don't be too judgmental about these populists. By just telling them to vote for New Labour, the problem will not be resolved. Yeah? And therefore they don't vote for New Labour anymore. So one more a little diagram which I find helpful. Now here then we see that in the process of democracy moving away from regulatory influence over the economy, the democratic state, or the democratic debt state, begins to face no longer just one constituency, but two constituencies that are struggling for supremacy with each other. And I call them the Staatsvolk, the people of the state, and the Marktvolk, the people of the market. Yeah? Now these are very different peoples. In the traditional way, they are nationally organized, they are citizens, they enjoy civil rights, they go to vote, they express themselves through periodic elections, they form a public opinion, whatever that is, owe loyalty to the government and to the state, and receive public services in turn. Yeah? So it's a constitutional thing, based in public law. But the other competing constituency is one that is constituted through private law, through commercial law. And it is international in nature. It consists of investors rather than citizens. It has commercial claims where the others have civil rights. They are creditors as opposed to voters. And they can, through the auctions of public debt, continually impact on the behavior of the state. Because auctions take place all the time, whereas elections are only every 4 years. Yeah? Where the others form a public opinion, they form interest rates. Yeah? And interest rates are much better to read than public opinion. And they have more immediate consequences for the fiscal position of the state. And where the others owe loyalty, they owe or don't owe confidence, the confidence of investors. Yeah. They can withdraw that confidence in the same way in which a citizen can withdraw his loyalty and revolt. They don't have to have Kalashnikovs. All they need is, they just don't buy the stuff anymore. They can exit. And where the others want public services, these want debt service. And they want debt service in an assured, regular way. Yeah? So my image is the state now, governments now have to look at these two constituencies and try to balance their different demands. And then the question is, which one is the more powerful one? And in the Hayekian scheme, it is completely clear. It is the Marktvolk. Like in the United States, where in the public consciousness and in law and in the Constitution, the way it is interpreted, it is firmly invested that paying off your debt as a state precedes any other liability that the state may have, even pensions. Yeah? The American state pays off the creditors of the state, and only then comes everything else. That's the condition that I think is where democracies are generally being pressed. Now, let me now say something on the European Union, which I call a travesty of the standard model. Now, you can imagine there are these national democracies, and on top of it sits a thing called a supranational institution or international institution, supranational democracy. But it does have a parliament, but the parliament doesn't elect a government. It has a government, but it is neither elected nor accountable. It works through multi-level diplomacy, which is sort of an interesting idea. Merkel goes to Brussels, comes back and says, I fought for you, but unfortunately we have to sell the railways to public investors because everybody else in Europe does it too. And then people say, we want to keep our railways. And she says, wow, but if I now go back to Brussels and open up this whole package, all sorts of bad things can happen. Yeah? this is sort of in international relations very nicely researched how this works. This is the mechanism of government. No political parties, or parties, or if there are parties, they have no constituents. And it's very interesting that these European so-called political parties resemble very much the parties that Peter Mayer describes in Hollowing the Void. They have, and they are sort of an exaggeration even. Parties, Mayer says, that have withdrawn from society and moved into the state apparatus. Now, no other parties are closer in a state apparatus and further away from society than the Brussels parties. Yeah? Parties, says Peter Mayer, that have become so centrist that their programs can no longer be distinguished between a Christian Democratic or a Social Democratic party. Now, here it's even worse. Between Herr Juncker and Herr Schulz, I call them Herr Schunker and Herr Schulz, there's no difference. There's no difference at all. Yeah, last year at the European election, they pretended that they were running against each other for the position of. In Britain, nobody even noticed this. Yeah, and they were so Gegenkandidaten. In Germany, they showed up in television 3 times, and people asked them, were they different? They would say, well, I don't really know. And they never differ. Yeah? So this is the political party. There are no trade unions with members there. There's no collective bargaining. There's no public in this political system because it fragments into national publics. They find it, even highly trained political scientists studying comparative politics find it hard, for example, if you're French, to understand German politics, or vice versa. And even British politics is sometimes difficult to understand for an outsider, maybe for the Brits themselves. So this is what I call the travesty. And indeed, as Peter Mayer, again to quote him, this system was never intended to be democratic. In fact, it was built to be immune to democracy. Because the idea was that European integration would have to happen through technocratic needs and necessities rather than the free will of the people, because the people weren't trusted. After the war, maybe with a good reason. So the system was insulated, carefully insulated from political popular pressure. And in the process, it turned into an engine of market expansion. And now an international regime, with the help of Margaret Thatcher, but maybe this was anyway the trajectory of the time, and now into an international regime for the enforcement of fiscal rectitude on the side of the Marktforum. An internationalized version of the consolidation state. This is what Europe in the monetary union is. I thought the British would never opt out of the European Union because they weren't in monetary union. Monetary union is the real problem. That is a known engine that sucks these southern countries dry for the benefit of the German export industry. Yeah? And there's no end in sight. Yeah? So, and you could add to this list, no taxation, no duties coming with citizenship, only rights. Under European monetary, suspension of party competition at national level. Now, under the new fiscal compact, you can have national elections, but which party, whatever party wins the elections, they have to stick by the budget guidelines, which means that the classic thing for the standard model of democracy, which was the Social Democratic Party governs, they slightly overshoot for the welfare state, then the Conservative Party governs, they slightly undershoot, but everything sort of creeps up and it adds up to a straight line. Yeah? So we had some sort of democracy, but balancing itself. Now, even this is gone. Brussels will tell a country what the macroeconomic indicators for the next years are going to be, and that is it. In fact, they even tell the Greeks to get rid of collective bargaining. Okay, now let me say something on populism, and then and on the case of the United Kingdom, which I think we will discuss later in a little more depth. In my view, what we now see in the United Kingdom is one aspect, one permutation of a very general crisis, which I call the dialectics of integration and fragmentation. Integration of the world market and fragmentation of politics. Brexit is another step in the multifaceted decomposition of the modern state between global pressures and regional adjustment, regional resistance. Yeah? In all these countries, regions want more autonomy in order to respond better with their own resources to the pressures of the world market, of which their national state can no longer protect them, or has given up protecting them, like the British state, which in the 1980s intentionally prevented the European Union from becoming a social welfare state on the British model. Yes, and afterwards used the license that they had from Brussels not being able to interfere with their neoliberal policies to run down their own economy by selling the houses of London to Greek ship owners and Saudi Arabian sheikhs, yes, and making a lot of money over it in the principle of the freedom of the market. So preventing Brussels from interfering with a Thatcherist regional policy, social policy, and so on and so on. So that's one aspect. You can do it like this, but then sort of Brussels was incapacitated as a result of this. I worked in the 1980s with European trade unions in the pursuit of this chimera called the social dimension of Europe. Yeah. Nobody talks about it anymore. It's gone. It won't return. Yeah. But people have the good thing is if you're older, you have a memory. Unfortunately, younger people have no memory. So now I see them saying, let's have a social dimension in Europe. But there are historical windows that can close. Yeah. The European Union is no longer suitable for this purpose, as I've shown. Yeah. So another step in this sort of dialectic. Nation-state confers economic sovereignty to a supranational state, which then turns into an agent of market expansion. Yeah? The supranational state opens up local markets. The national state blames the supranational state for the unpleasant consequences, Britain. Yeah? British immigration policy after the accession of Eastern Europe was we don't need protect or transition period like all other European countries. We invite the Polish plumbers right now. The idea behind it was to put pressure on the English plumbers. Now the English plumbers are against the Polish plumbers because they feel threatened by them. Then the Brexit conservative Brexiteers tell them, you see, it's the European Union that is to blame. Let's get out of it and throw the Poles out. Yeah? What I want to say is that once you have the right sort of perspective on this, you can see how many different combinations of these elements are possible, and smart politicians are always sort of able to discover new, like Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, to discover new combinations of sort of institutional and ideological building blocks that are lying around and that you can put together for a while in order to fool other people. Yeah? So the result, the European Union, in particular European Monetary Union, serves as a powerful engine of liberalization, supporting neoliberalism also in the UK, although they, of course, have gone for it themselves, also by absorbing the blame for it. Yeah, then it's their fault. So now you have all these sort of multifaceted crises, and I just want to mention a few, and then I stop. two crises, one of national protection, one of supranational integration. They take place at the same time. The UK, sort of a threefold decomposition of their polity. The government decomposes, the opposition decomposes, the national territory decomposes. Yeah? If this is not a crisis of the national state, I don't know what is. Britain sort of returns to being two nations, Disraeli notwithstanding, the winners of globalization and the losers of globalization. The winners you could see on television, at least from Germany, sort of demonstrating in central London. You saw young people who, with the human capital that they have acquired in their country, either at public expense or at the expense of their parents, yeah, wanting to use that human capital globally, in combination with the language that I speak incompetently, yeah, but they have learned it at home. And so I think the world is my oyster. Yeah, why does anyone want me not to work in Hong Kong, Brussels, Berlin, or wherever? Yeah, so. But then there are others who don't have this human capital, who are not demonstrating, but they might be demonstrating the moment the Brexit would be reversed through another referendum, when these young college graduates get their will. Yeah? And that is what I call a split into two nations with on the brink of violence, at least if one believes the social media. Two movements against the dictatorship of the market, for unlimited access to market opportunities, also in other countries, another split. And three camps: bourgeois supranationalism, working class nationalism, separatist regionalism, and so on, and so on, and so on. And I want to finish by saying that don't think that these fractions, these processes of decomposition are unique to Britain. In different form, you see them in France, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, Greece anyway. Although the Greeks have been so humiliated by the rest of the Europeans that they don't speak anymore. Yeah. But that very process of the Greeks being crushed by the European Union, monetary union, Germany leading the pack, yeah, that very process is part of this process that I describe as the decoupling of democracy from the economy and the re-emergence of fissures, fragmentations that one would have thought had been overcome through the post-war compromise that was to sort of establish some balanced, centrist, moderate governance of the capitalist dynamic process. So, people always jump to conclusions and then they have grandiose ideas of what to do. I would prefer first to let sink in the enormity of the challenge that we're now facing in Europe, and not come up with ideas that might sound nicely in the company of social scientists, but have no base in the world out there, where people are struggling and trying to make sense of what is happening to their societies and to themselves. Last call, democracy and capitalism. Thank you.